Well, welcome everybody. We're having a special universities lecture sponsored event this evening. We at the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies are very pleased to welcome Marjan Ehsassi of the Federation for Innovation and Democracy, North America, to share with us about the theme of the promise of citizen assemblies. This event is co-sponsored by our friends at the Morgridge Center for Public Service here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as the Robert M. La Follette School of Public Affairs. And again, university lectures supported Marjan's travel and some of the other aspects of having this event tonight. We're really happy that some of you were able to be here in person, and we also are pleased to have audience members from all over via Zoom. And I think it's going to be a really interesting topic to explore today, the day after we just did a community conference on civic health in Wisconsin and beyond from our Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies and the Civic Health of Wisconsin initiative. And there we explored many different types of interventions and initiatives that can help us to address some vulnerabilities in our civic health and our democracy. And tonight we're going to get to do a bit of a deep dive on one type of intervention that Marjan has both investigated, developed, and is now able to deploy through the organization that she works with. I was lucky enough to discover FIDE, which is the abbreviation that we use for the organization, in its, I suppose, original format, which was based in Brussels, Belgium, doing work mostly internationally a couple of years ago. And through an initial connection made there, was informed that indeed in North America, there would now be a branch of this organization and that Marjan would be directing it, and I should get in touch with her. And since then, we've had the opportunity to overlap at events like the National Conference on Citizenship in Washington, D.C., which is one of many spaces where people trying to do innovations for democracy come together. And it's been a real pleasure to get to know Marjan a bit personally and know more about her work. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Marjan Ehsassi is a leading democracy advocate and sought-after expert on citizen assemblies and their transformative impact on civic engagement. As the executive director of FIDE-North America, Ehsassi combines her extensive academic background with practical experience to advance institutional reform. Holding a doctorate from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and a law degree from McGill in Canada, Marjan is the author of Activated Citizenship, The Transformative Power of Citizens' Assemblies, which explores how citizens' assemblies can promote democratic renewal, social cohesion, and build mutual trust between elected officials and their constituents. Her book introduces the term voice insecurity to spotlight one of the drivers of political grievance. Prior to leading FIDE, she held positions at the World Bank and the National Democratic Institute, where she led governance programs in Asia and the Middle East. She's a member of the OECD Innovative Citizen Participation Network and on the advisory committee of the Democracy R&D Network. She's a frequent speaker at forums like the Athens Democracy Forum, the American Democracy Summit, and has been featured in prestigious publications, including the New York Times, Toronto Star, the Boston Globe, based in Washington, D.C. And I know now she'll be adding to that list and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Just kidding. But we're extremely honored and excited that we've been able to bring FIDE and Marjan to Wisconsin for the very first time. Dr. Ehsassi is also fluent in English, French, and Farsi. So I want to say thank you, merci beaucoup, and mamnoon.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth. I'm going to put this here. Just a moment. Oops. I want to thank the Commons. It's great to be here. I want to thank the Commons. I want to thank Mary Beth Collins, Michaela Wong, and Laura Evans for everything you've done. It's been a really lovely trip, and it's really a pleasure to be here. It's been a treat being with you at the conference yesterday, and this morning I had the opportunity to attend a class. And as I said yesterday, I will leave a far more hopeful person. The students that I've met at the University of Washington, the projects, University of Wisconsin. I'm so sorry. The projects that they were presenting yesterday and the conversations that we had, and then this morning, the questions that were being asked were just so incredible and really inspiring. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to speak for a little bit, just give you a little bit of a background on myself and FIDE, and then talk about the why of citizens' assemblies, really trying to frame the problem that we're trying to solve, and talk a little bit about voice and security, and then get into citizens' assemblies. I'll give you a little case study of an assembly, and we can talk about the key components, and then talk about our theory of change, and then citizens' assemblies across the US, what we have seen over the past 2 years with FIDE, and then CAs as trust multipliers, as we like to talk about them. So my background is I spent about 15, 16 years working in international development, going around the world trying to strengthen democratic institutions in other countries. And then in 2016, I had an awakening, and there were a number of different factors that were involved. The election, of course, was a moment for me, a real wake-up call, I think. Also, I live in Washington, D.C., and raising my two kids in D.C., and just feeling the inequalities in the United States, as someone who didn't grow up in the United States, was quite alarming to me. That same year, my brother became a member of parliament in Canada, and we had spent a very long time during his campaign knocking on doors. And I realized that having lived in Maryland for some time, in DC for some time, in New York for some time, I never really got those knocks at my doors. And the whole idea of engaging with constituents just didn't seem to be very healthy. And so I decided to pivot and do some work on US democracy. But of course, as an immigrant, I didn't know much about US government. I went back to school. I went to Johns Hopkins to get my doctoral degree. And what's really relevant for this conversation is that my problem statement that entire time and still was, why are the citizens of more developed Western democracies so disengaged? And are there ways that we can engage with them that makes them want to continue being involved with their political institutions? And as I was doodling, not knowing that my thesis would then become a book, I was looking at sort of different definitions of political efficacy, and they just didn't really seem to be complete. So I created my own little variables, and I decided that I would use these to measure good engagement. The very first variable that's been important to me is the epistemic growth piece. It is very rare that we design engagements for constituents at any level, at the city level, regional level, state level, or federal level, frankly, where we think about making sure that people feel that they are more informed about the subject after they leave, whether it's writing a survey or going to a town hall. The second variable was connectedness. Are people, as a result of this engagement, are they feeling more connected with each other? Are they leaving feeling like they know people that they haven't gotten to know in their communities before? Effervescence, this is one that people really seem to enjoy. The idea here for me was really that when you leave a participatory platform, you should feel more excited about your democracy. You should feel more excited about being a part of something bigger than yourself. Political engagement is quite obvious. Are you talking about the news more? Are you engaging in volunteerism more? And then finally, and this is a theme that I will come back to several times, consequential voice. And that doesn't mean that I can't speak or I can't write an article, but it means when I do provide my input, do I feel that I'm being listened to? Do I feel that my input matters? So then I did my doctoral degree. I was very involved with citizens' assemblies around the world. And then we launched FIDE 2 years ago, based in Washington, D.C. And the work that we do is really to advocate for institutional reforms that advance a more responsive and inclusive democracy. We're an independent and trusted partner, and we work very, very specifically on results-driven citizens' assemblies. So very quickly, the work we do, and then we'll get into what assemblies are, we say that we train, we design, and we evaluate. So we train by building capacity. We do workshops, both larger capacity building schools that we've held, and we also do curated workshops that are place-based. So we just had one in Richmond. We were in Central Oregon region a couple weeks ago, and we're going to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Many of our capacity building schools are now being driven by either mayors or city managers or commissioners. We also design. So we then hold the hand of cities mainly because that's most of our work. And I'll talk a little bit about the work that we do at the state level. We will hold the hands of the electeds throughout the process so that we can bring the best. But we are not implementers. My intention was not to compete with implementers that are doing this work across the country. It was really to be additive so that we can help bring the best practices to those cities that are doing this work. And then finally, evaluation. This has been very exciting. I had noticed during my doctoral degree that no one was using the same methodology across citizens' assemblies so that we can really start gathering some data that can be comparative, because whether we're speaking to electeds or we're speaking to donors, people are asking for the data. So we've started doing independent evaluations of assemblies as they happen. And this is one of the beautiful things about the US being a bit of a blank canvas. Until a few years ago, we had our first assembly, and we'll talk about that, is that we can start building and learning from what our sort of colleagues in other parts of the world have not done. So just taking a step back for a minute, we all agree, I think, that our democratic practice is not where it needs to be, that engagement is broken. But I feel often when we talk about solutions to our problems, we're all over the place. And so what we do at FIDE, and we try to really be very thoughtful about, is what are the problems that we are trying to solve? And when we think about the program ideas and the initiatives that we get involved with, there are three. One is lack of accountability, lack of responsiveness, and lack of inclusion. And so what do I mean by that? Not accountable means that people don't feel across the US, but also around the world, and the data shows this, that they can hold their government accountable. And what we mean by this is that we have a very minimalistic definition of what a democracy is. And the US is especially bad about this. We define our voice as our vote. So every few years, we are asked to come and vote for our electeds, but in between elections, we really don't hold them, or we don't have mechanisms to hold them accountable. So the lack of accountability is a real issue for us. And I have the data. I won't go through it because I know that we don't have that much time, but there is data, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the data that demonstrates that people don't feel that they can hold government accountable. What do we mean by non-responsive? Non-responsive is really the lack of policy congruence. More and more Americans are feeling like the laws, the regulations that they're asked to live by on a day-to-day basis don't reflect their preferences. And you can see here, and it's actually quite astonishing, that ever since 1964, 65, where, the line between government is being run by a few big interests and for the benefit of all people, those lines have diverged, and that gap is becoming increasingly bigger and bigger. So for us, policy is really important. Making sure, and we say at FIDE, we say putting the public back in public policy, making sure that Americans across the United States feel that their voice is not only being heard, but the policies that are being changed, the government decision-making that is being done, reflects their preferences. And then finally, non-inclusive. And this is the issue of voice. When you ask people, do you believe that there is or isn't an adequate system in place for the voice of Americans to be heard? Most Americans, regardless of their political beliefs, don't think there's enough of a voice. And so the lack of inclusion is one that is really important to us. And I'll talk a little bit about the components in assemblies that are important. I wanted to show this to you because it's a really interesting data that came out of the OECD last year. They did a study on drivers of trust. And if you look at the different markers that they used to be able to gauge high trust and low trust across OECD countries, the marker where the difference between low voice and high voice is the largest is where people feel like they have a say in government decision-making, which is quite astounding that you can go from 20% to about 70% because you feel like you have voice in government decision-making. Much higher change and kind of margin for change from any of the other markers, including financial worries, participating in politics, gender, and age. at FIDE, I mentioned this. I introduced the term voice insecurity in my book, and I just put it into the introduction, not thinking that anybody would be interested, but it's really, people have responded quite positively to it. So we just engaged with a student to write a report on voice insecurity. And so what we try to do is we try and compare voice insecurity to food insecurity in the report, but much like income insecurity and housing insecurity, we do feel that there are Americans that are feeling like their voice is really not being heard. Now, I also wanted to show you over the past couple of years, as we talk and we engage with electeds and people who are appointed in government, the problems that we hear from them are also very similar to the problems that we think we have in our democracy. We often hear from electeds that they are struggling with polarization and mis and disinformation in their communities. The problem of loneliness, of course, the epidemic of loneliness we are all familiar with, but our electeds are also very aware of. Usual suspects, this comes up all the time. And it is very interesting because 2 years ago when we started, it was a far harder sell when we were talking to electeds about the problems that we thought they needed to address. There is far greater recognition that these are real problems and that they only hear from usual suspects, either the people who love them or the people who really don't like them. And then disengaged residents, of course, and then lack of trust, which we'll come back to again. So what is a citizens' assembly and why might it be a solution? And again, it is not a panacea, it is not a cure-all, but we do believe that when the question, the public issue is real, a citizens' assembly can play a really big role. So I thought that maybe I would take you through a case study that I think kind of shows a little bit the complexity of how a citizens' assembly can actually solve some public problems. A few years ago, I was asked to be one of 4 international guarantors for President Macron's second Citizens Convention. So he, a couple of years earlier, had started and led a Citizens Convention on the climate, where they brought about 150 French citizens to write proposals around the climate issue. A couple of years later, when he was running his second campaign, it's no kind of it's French, I mean, euthanasia and assisted suicide has been an issue in France with many French people every year, thousands of French people actually going to Switzerland, going to Belgium, going to other countries to avail themselves to some of the services that they can get there. So he made a promise during his second run for presidency that if he were to be elected, he would engage with the nation around a debate around euthanasia and assisted suicide. So once he won, the issue became, all right, let's do a national dialogue. And so we, through sortition, we picked 184 French citizens to come together to Paris. And these are people from not just across the country, but also people from the different republics. So we had people from Martinique who came, from Réunion who came, and we met in Paris over 9 weekends. So 27 days, these 184 people came. We started with 185, and this is an important point, but we ended with 184. One person had to drop out. Only one person dropped out. And the reason they had to drop out is they didn't have a job when they started with us, but they had a job that didn't allow them to come and join us on Fridays and Saturdays. So 184 people went through the entire process of those 9 weekends and 27 days. And the criteria that we used to select through sortition of the French was gender, age, region, education level, socio-professional categories, and the urban-rural divide. We wanted to make sure that they were very representative of the French population. As I mentioned, they debated over 9 weekends and 27 days. They received a stipend. I'm happy to talk more about the types of measures that we take to make sure that we remove as much as we can those barriers to participation, including transportation, of course, childcare, and stipend as well. The final report included 65 proposals, and 92% of the participants approved it. There were 76% of the people at the end of this 27-day that were in favor of a change in the law. And there were 20-some people who said that they weren't. So the minority report and the final report that we have includes the minority view as well. And this process was probably the most costly of all assemblies that we have had internationally. There have been about 800. it was about 5 million euros for the 27 days. But the question that was asked, before I get into the thing, the question that the government asked, and this was a brilliant move in the workshops to draft the remit, was, are the services around palliative care sufficient? And if not, what needs to be changed? And so the way that we worded that remit, which is the question that you ask in an assembly people to address, was around building trust. So in the first few sessions, as people were learning together, and I will go through the components. So every assembly starts with a government body that has a public problem and they want people to provide input. That is the number one piece, that you need that component before you move forward. And then we do sortition to pick and to select this very representative sampling of people. Now, when they come together, whether it's over 6 sessions, and normally in the States now, as we're doing this more and more, because budgets are smaller, we usually have 5 or 6 sessions. They come together. The very first component is learning. So before they debate, they argue, they are learning together. And we have the data to show that their positions change. They change their position throughout the learning process. Then they deliberate together, and then they write their proposals. So in this case, this was a very complicated structure, but I wanted you to see this because this is probably the most elaborate structure that I have ever seen. So we had a governance committee, we had a steering committee that was making decisions, and I can answer any questions around these things. We had the drawing of the lots, so the sortition team that did the sortition for us, and then the participatory platform. There was a platform that was created to make sure that this mini public was connected to the larger French sort of community, and that there was comments that were picked up and stuff. The leaders and the facilitators, of course, and then we had the support team. We had fact checkers to make sure that when people had questions, we could answer those questions. You have writers. We were the guarantors, of course. And then we also had neutral observers. And so the way that this was very successful, and I will also say, the law has still not changed. So it's been 2 years since the 184, including all the teams that supported them, we went to the Élysée and they submitted their final report to President Macron. And he said that he was ordering the Assemblée nationale, the legislative body, to make a change in the law. It has gone back and forth from the Assemblée nationale to the Senate. The Senate is now reviewing a new draft, a revised draft of the law, and it will go back to the Assemblée this summer, and the expectation that it will be voted in favor of. So these processes are slow. They do take a long time, even when they're workshopped well, even when you try, though there are questions, and we can talk about this, the extent to which maybe the president should have brought the Assemblée nationale along more, and that buy-in should have been sought a little bit more. But the process was very, very efficient. We had a governance committee and then the guarantors, and worked very hard to sort of make sure that we had a evolving process so that we could course correct each time. There were lots of things that happened, including, most importantly, the fact that the participants wanted to be more and more involved. So from session to session, they would come and say, well, we really want to be involved in the press conferences. And so we would make sure that we were able to provide media training so that they could do the press conferences themselves. And this is a part of the work that we're doing in citizens' assemblies, where we're really trying more and more to make sure that we don't just bring citizens to an assembly, but that we also give them more and more power so that the co-creation process is actually one that they feel they own a lot more. In France, I also want to mention, and this is one of the things that we are talking to different bodies here in the US about, they have an institution called the CESE, which is in charge of relationships between the government and the people. So they have a convening power, and they are able to organize the assemblies. The policy impact piece I did talk about. I wanted to mention this too, because this was really powerful. The majority perspective, of course, was, they were very happy at the end of the assembly, but the minority perspective, and Soline, who's here, was one of the sort of loudest spokespeople for the minority perspective. And at the very last session, she said, I want to thank the majority for giving the minority 50% of the time. And so designing assemblies in a way where the minority voice also feels really heard is very important. And at the end, you have an assembly where everyone can feel heard. Now, some of the lessons from this assembly, and these are lessons that we try and apply internationally, certainly in the US as well, is the selection of the topic. The selection of the topic was one that people wanted. They were eager to sort of engage in a conversation around euthanasia and assisted suicide, but they didn't really vote for it. And at the same time that this was happening, I don't know if you remember, but there were protests on pension reform in Paris a couple of years ago. And people were saying, well, why don't we have an assembly on pension reform? And so I say this because for anybody who's thinking about doing assemblies, we are certainly at FIDE trying to create mechanisms where we're working with cities. We make sure that the selection of the topic also reflects people's priorities. And so the topic that you're selecting is one that really resonates with people. Obviously, I mentioned this, a co-creation process that is more robust. A stronger connection with the public is also very important. So let's now take a step back and just think a little bit. I'm looking at the time too, another 10 minutes. Just what is an assembly? So an assembly, just sort of to think about the different ingredients that we just talked about, is a mandating government body that has a thorny public problem and is seeking public input. The second part of this is that it's long form. It is a long form deliberative process. There is a history of deliberation in the United States. There is also a very robust history of using sortition in trying to recruit people. But with citizens' assemblies, and for them to truly be impactful, you need to think about longer sessions. I've heard very much about assemblies and we get calls, can we do this in 2 days? You really can't, because no matter what the topic is, if you think about a day for learning, and we can talk more if you're interested about how we do the learning, day for deliberation, for writing of the proposals, and then of course presenting it, you definitely need at least 4 days minimum, if not more. And then, of course, randomly selected group of people. And then, as we've discussed, 3 very distinct phases in every assembly: learning, the development of the consensus-based, and then information proposals on complex policies. So just an idea here, just to give you a scope, and we have this on our website. I think I have a QR code here for our standards and definitions. All these documents are available on our website as well. But these are the ways that we sort of describe assemblies. Assemblies are the representativeness of assemblies, of course, through sortition. You have a clear remit, which is very complicated. We spend hours and hours trying to write that question that you want people to come and answer. Adequate time, diversity of information. The whole idea with the learning phase is that you want to be able to sort of present a diversity and a range of perspectives. Deliberate, of course, not debate, a free response and a final report, and then accountability. It is very important. We will not work with processes where we're not confident that at the end of the assembly, the champion, the government body that has mandated this will show up, will receive the final report, and will say, we will respond to you within 6 months, within 9 months. Now, assemblies are nowhere in the world are they binding. They're still consultative, but it is really important for government to be held accountable. So what are we saying? Ooh, that slide looks funny. I'm sorry. I'm not sure what's going on there. So just to give you an idea of what we have seen in the United States. So before we launched FIDE, so 3.5 years ago, the US had its very first citizens assembly in Petaluma, which is north of San Francisco. The issue was a land use issue. And that was 3 years ago. I happened to be a researcher and wrote a case study for that assembly. Since then, we have had citizens assemblies in many different states. In Colorado, we've had in Montrose, Colorado. Last year, we had an assembly in Boulder, Colorado as well, Fort Collins, Colorado. So Colorado is becoming very interested in assemblies. We also have had Culver City. And then this year, we started 2026 with an assembly in Dayton, Ohio, which we're working towards, an assembly in Akron, Ohio, which we're also involved with. Lexington, Kentucky just completed their assembly a few weeks ago, and we're doing the independent evaluation for that. And Snohomish County, Washington State, is doing the first assembly on AI and the use of AI in local government. So all of this is happening. There's incredibly increased interest. At the same time, FIDE last year was able to receive some funding to bring together a bipartisan coalition of governors' offices. So that program is moving forward quite strong. We have 5 states that have joined our cohort, and we don't have the actual governors as part of a cohort, but we have their secretaries of state and chiefs of staff. And so we're working with Maryland, you see them in yellow, Maryland, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Utah, and Washington State. We launched the program in February in Washington, D.C., and we're taking, and this is actually the highest, sort of the most senior delegation from the U.S. on democratic innovations going to Europe to visit a series of citizens' assemblies to learn more about them and to be able to observe them while we're in Brussels. And then theory of change, I'll just spend a couple minutes on this just to give you an idea. We were really surprised last year that there was really no theory of change. Coming from the international development space, we don't really design programs without a theory of change and indicators and all of that. And it's been quite interesting learning about sort of the US space, the way that we work in the US space. So with a lack of, and I have to also say our colleagues in Europe also didn't have a theory of change. So we decided that we would launch a theory of change. We were also very surprised that donors didn't have a real definition for what this process that they're starting to fund, what success looks like for them. And so we launched, we had several workshops with donors, we had workshops with implementers, we had workshops with researchers to try and put together a theory of change. And I'm just showing you the first page. It's actually an 8-page document that's on our website, and we've also socialized it at several conferences internationally. And the way we look at this, so obviously you have the problem statement, and then those are the assembly components that are rather fixed. But in terms of outcome, the way that we think about this now is 3 levels of outcome. So we look at individual outcomes, the ways in which the participants change as a result of their participation in assembly. We look at societal outcomes, the ways in which society and communities might be impacted by citizens' assemblies. And then finally, of course, institutional outcomes. And this is more the way that our institutions are being perceived by the participants. And finally, just a word about trust, because for us, this is really important. It's been rather interesting hearing sort of, it's become very trendy to talk about lack of trust. But for any of us who've worked in this space, I mean, we have seen declining trust across the United States, certainly, and internationally, but certainly across the States for probably 2 decades. So it's interesting that it's something that we talk about so much more. For us, actually, at FIDE, we don't see the health of a democracy sort of only measured by the ways in which people trust their political institutions. We, in fact, think that it's more important for us to think about trust in other ways as well. And these are ways in which we have seen and we have data to demonstrate that assemblies can be impacted. So, of course, citizens' confidence in government and institutions is renewed. And I do want to open a parenthesis. That's not always the case. It's only when citizens' assemblies are designed and implemented well where we see increases in trust. There are many examples of assemblies where trust it does not increase. And it's important to talk about that. But when they are designed well and implemented well, and government is a true partner, we do see trust increasing. And then citizens' trust in their own political agency grows. I mean, the number of times that we have seen participants leave assemblies and not just go volunteer on someone else's campaign or read a book or do more volunteerism, they run their own campaigns. We have example after example of people who have left an assembly that we did in Yukon last year and run for office. In France, we have seen them run for becoming mayor. So all of that is very interesting, and we've actually just received funding to launch the first ever alum network for assembly members, because we want to be able to provide them with all sorts of different training, including leadership training after they leave an assembly. And then citizens from all walks of life, of course, they learn to trust each other. That, social cohesion, definitely, even in the worst of assemblies, people come together and they want to continue being engaged with each other. And then the last piece, and I think this is really important, we don't really have data for this, it's all anecdotal, but the way in which government views the public. as a result of an assembly is also different. We see time and time again when electeds come to our assemblies and they say, wow, people are really smart. Why haven't I used them this way before? They're really committed to this work. And so we do believe that as a result of assemblies, people's trust in the public also changes. And I guess with that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions. But if any of this is interesting, please sign up for our newsletter. And we'd love to stay in touch.
So my name is Corey Jackson. I'm a professor in the information school here. So a lot of my kind of research early on deal with something called citizen science. So scientists put data online and people come and do really interesting and meaningful things with that data, but it's just kind of serve a scientific purpose. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how we teach people these really complex scientific topics or tasks. And there seems to sometimes be an upper limit or a ceiling on what we can teach people. Like not everybody's going to be a nuclear physicist and solve those types of problems. Do you see there being an upper limit on the types of problems or thorny, I think you call them thorny problems that governments are able to sort of offload or engage with through this process?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that there's a diversity, right? There's a range of abilities in every assembly because it is a representative sampling. So what I may be able to learn and you may be able to learn, the amount of time you might have to spend on different learnings is very different. But in terms of the subject, I don't think there is any subject that is too challenging for a representative sampling of people to tackle with. And, the expectation that we have is not that people come together and write proposals that we've never thought of. The expectation, I mean, it's always nice, and there always is, because you have people with lived experience in that room who are looking at that problem differently than people who might have, 3 PhDs and might be nuclear physicists. But the way that they think about solving the problems are very real. And so I have not seen any topic, and there have been very complicated topics like 5G and different things that are hard to understand, even AI. But I don't think that there's anything that is beyond average citizens to be able to sort of learn about and propose policy solutions to. And also don't forget that we do the learning phase, and I should have said this, we bring experts. So we have experts who present to them. So we have what we call testimony, and the testimonies that we receive are usually in 3 buckets. So we have academics who come to present objective facts to the proposal around the issue area. And then we have stakeholders, so community stakeholders who are usually advocates who come and sort of present to them from different perspectives. And then we have people with lived experience as well.
Hi, I work for a local city government and am partnering with our elected administration to consider doing a citizen assembly. So we're in the process of seeing if this would be a good fit, and particularly around housing in our city, and some just kind of community concerns around housing. There are state legislation that kind of restricts some of the abilities of our local government to implement a lot of policy changes. And so I guess my question is, how do we help assembly members, if we do implement this, to kind of understand those constraints and understand kind of the practical realities of what our government, our
Can and can't.
can and can't do?
I mean, it's complicated, but there are lots of policy issues that have different layers, right? So there are different ways of going about it. One is making sure that your remit is very clear. And so making sure that your remit is narrow enough so that there will probably be confusion, but there's less confusion about where they can and where they can't go. Also making sure that the learning phase, of course, and being clear. I mean, these things can often be offset by just clear communications and clear sort of understanding of what the remit is asking them to do. This might also provide an opportunity if you think your statewide officials would be interested in hearing, and that doesn't mean that they have to take them and change policy, but there could also be allowance given to certain recommendations are sort of at the city level, but some are at the state level, and you have state representatives who come and at least hear what they have to say, which would be quite empowering. And there's this tension within all of us that work in this space, because we often will ask people to come in and sort of think outside the box. We say to them, we want to hear your thoughts. But then from the second that they arrive, we have them meet with this person who's providing testimony and that expert. So I say this because I think that there's also something really empowering about having people just ideate and go in directions that they want to. And I think that can be very empowering as long as you're really clear that the mandate here is with the city or the mayor or I don't know who, and that they can only actually really entertain certain proposals that are crafted a certain way. If people understand that, but still want to kind of provide an inspiring kind of list of proposals, why not? I mean, I have colleagues who sometimes say, the proposals don't have to just be addressed that year. Maybe some of the proposals will be looked at 3 years from now, or 4 years from now, or 5 years from now. And there is something there, I think. I don't know if I answered your question well.
Do you have any in the Zoom?
Thanks for the presentation. I'm really interested in this idea that the government starts viewing the public as a resource in a new way, and sort of think about how that happens. I was just in a conversation about young people and government, and people starting to see young people as almost said exactly the thing you just said, which is, what we really care about this. We actually have very strong ideas, and if people listen to us, they can take us more seriously. Then I think we could be in a different place. So I think, yeah, I mean, applies to so many unheard voices. But I'm curious about sort of the mechanism by which that happens, because I feel like I hear you saying clearly the citizen assembly process has a powerful impact on the participant, right? And they're the ones who it sounds like are being inspired and empowered to run for office or make other changes. And so I'm just sort of wondering, where might how do you see this sort of like rippling out into the political process? Do you see lots of citizen assemblies popping up, or is there a different way in which citizens start to think about their participation in government, or government creating other spaces without going through all this formality? I'm just wondering about the process by which those governments starting to have this experience and they say, okay, there's value here. And I see it at the individual level. And so how does it institutionalize, or where are you hoping it goes, even if you haven't had time to get there? If that's a very big, long-winded question.
No, it's a great question. It is a big question, but it's a really good one. So first of all, you said youth, and I just wanted to mention, for those of you who aren't familiar with youth assemblies, our partners in Canada, Mass LBP, that we've worked very closely with last year, held a youth assembly on the climate, and they brought 40-some Canadians between the ages of 18 and 24. They did some of their work online, of course, because Canada, like us, is a big country, but then they brought them together in Ottawa, and we were there and we did the independent evaluation. And they sat in the seat. It was mandated by the Canadian Senate. And for anyone who's been to Ottawa, the Canadian Senate is a formidable building. And they had the youth sit in the chairs of the senators. And the senators and some MPs were there to receive the final report. And it was an incredibly powerful experience, not just for the youth, but also for the senators who we're talking to now, who say they have been forever changed. And that document will provide the spirit with which they take any kind of climate action. So I think that people are moved. But to answer your question a little bit more kind of directly, I think the biggest thing that we see with electeds is that citizens' assemblies, when you're asking the right question, gives them the buy-in that they need. I mean, in so many cases, it's a real gift for them. We're working in the city of Dayton right now with an ordinance that's been passed. And so people have said, we want this to become law, but it's very hard to operationalize. So we're having a citizens' assembly to help the city understand how to operationalize this bill. So in that sense, it's a gift to electeds. And I think that it is being recognized as such. I mean, some of you may have heard Ireland, marriage equality, abortion, all of these rested on citizens' assemblies that then went to referendum. And so there was no other way to do this. Euthanasia and assisted suicide in France. So they do see this as a vehicle to create that kind of buy-in. Yes, we are seeing permanent structures. So Ostbelgien in German-speaking Belgium is now has a permanent structure of an assembly that works. The city of Paris has a permanent assembly. The Bundestag in Germany tried with an assembly, but then party politics it was not able to move forward, but they did have their first national assembly on nutrition. I will say to you that I'm a bit of an oddball here because most of my colleagues do believe in permanent assemblies. I'm not sure that I'm in favor of permanent assemblies. What I'm in favor of is having a pooled fund that allows any elected at any level, whether it's at the local level all the way up to the federal level, to be able to access this pooled fund when they think they have the right remit for an assembly. Because otherwise I worry that, assemblies might also become kind of this structure that is not really kind of agile. Whereas if we have a pooled fund to be able to access assemblies, I think, in my view, that's the healthier way to go.
Okay. Just curious if you can talk more about the evaluation. Like, what are those metrics that you said you're coming back for your evaluation process? One, how is that? Is that just a survey tool? Is there other forms of engagement you're doing? Just to hear more about that.
Such a good question. So we're evolving constantly. We have a teeny tiny budget for our evaluation work, and it's one area that actually people are becoming more and more interested in different cities. So what we do currently, which might change, and we're hoping that we can make it more rigorous, is currently, and it's really important for FIDE to sort of strengthen the muscle locally. So we don't send people to cities. We make sure that we build the muscle in those cities so they can do an assembly in the next year or 2 years later. So what we have started doing since last year is we will hire a PhD student in a city where it's happening. So we now have a lead evaluation fellow, we call them, or a PhD student in the city of Akron, in the city of Dayton, in Lexington, as well as in Snohomish. And it's a lot of work because we have weekly calls we have a research coordinator. He and I have weekly calls with them to make sure that we're troubleshooting and answering their questions. So that's kind of the body, that's the evaluator model that we currently have. And then the methodology is we do one survey at the beginning. So the very first session, we do a survey of participants. And then the lead evaluation fellow will observe all of the sessions. It's not always the case that they can observe all like 5 or 6, but they definitely will do at least 70% of the sessions. And so we have then observation notes. And then we do an end-line survey at the end, which allows us to kind of contrast, obviously, the baseline with the end line. And then we do anywhere between 8 to 12 in-depth interviews. And those in-depth interviews are with participants. We've used Sortition to pick the participants, so we're kind of playing around with it. And then we do facilitators, we do implementers, and we do electeds as well, so that we could get their story. And all of this is also based on the relationship between our evaluation fellow and the implementers, because in most cases, we're very close to the implementers. We will ask for our lead evaluation fellow to have debriefs after every session with the implementers as well, so that they can build more of a body of knowledge. That's what we're doing. We're really hoping, we were hopeful that in Dayton, we could work with Ohio State University to do a control group and a treatment group. And that still might be the case, because that will then really give us some more rigorous data. So we're trying, but our budget doesn't really allow us to do a lot more than that.
Thank you. This was wonderful. I'm curious how you work through the questions, because I think you said it's so important to have the right questions or to frame things in the right way. And so I'm just curious, what is that process for identifying and then, I don't know, iterating, refining the question or questions?
It's a really hard one. I mean, there is no science to it. It also, depending on the context, it depends on who should be in the room for each of these remit sessions that we have. But typically, I mean, what I like to say is the best marriage around a remit is a question that really is a priority for the people. And we now do that with focus groups. We can do that with surveys. We can do that with votes. That's really important. But then making sure that the policy cycle, as you can imagine, is also open to those changes, right? So that the best marriage is when those two meet. But in terms of the actual wording, so when we first started FIDE 2 years ago, we used to have community engagement folks come to our schools and be engaged with us. And we realized that we really needed to work with policy planners. So we now make sure that the policy planners are always sitting at the tables. We make sure that we understand what can be done. And it's a long process. I mean, I will tell you in Dayton specifically, since I brought it up, we have had design sessions, we've gone back and forth, because then, of course, to your question, it's really important for your remit to be neutral. It cannot be misleading. It cannot suggest in any way any sort of tendency towards one or another sort of decision that you want them to make. So all of that is really difficult. And it's especially difficult because the people who are in charge the day that you are doing this may no longer be there. And so making sure that you have a continuation and you have a core group of champions who are going to help see this through is very complicated. You know, we've had assemblies where the mayor is gone when the assembly proposals come out. So all of that is very complicated. And it's part of the reason why when we were doing our governors cohort, we made sure that the governors that we took into our program were governors that were going to stay and that didn't have an election this year, so that they could take the learning so that we could start working on remits next year with them, or this fall maybe. Yeah, but it's a complicated question.
I'm wondering if you've ever studied the actual process itself. I mean, because it seems really fascinating to bring people together to have arguments and debates, and how people's minds get changed by arguments. I'm wondering if you all ever like put a microphone in the room and try to do like a content or discourse analysis about how people come to the conclusions that they do during these sessions.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So we have followed many, many processes, and we do see that their positions changed, and we have that in surveys. But have we done any kind of recording? MIT does that, and I know that several assemblies have used recordings. I have not seen any results. I have seen sort of recordings being gathered without having been used. So I mean, it's something that's interesting. I think there's potential there. I also, you know, as someone who really cares about the experience that participants are having, it can be intrusive, and it can be difficult for them to build the trust that they need to and feel really comfortable debating in ways that they want to debate if they feel that they're being recorded. We don't use them in our processes, but I know that colleagues do. But when I have asked how has it worked, I haven't really seen the results that suggest that it's worked well or hasn't worked well.
We're getting a little close to time. I actually
Yeah.
do have an audience member question of my own, or a couple, but I will just say before I start asking my question that it's close to time. So if anybody does have another question from Zoom or in the room, just make sure that you've submitted it on Zoom or wave or something, because after this, otherwise I'm gonna kind of wrap us up here. So I'm gonna I have a few things, Marjan, I've been storing up while I've been listening to all this great discussion. I am myself, like you, trained as an attorney, and then now work in a Center for Civil Society and Community and Nonprofit Studies. So I think one of the reasons why I've been really inspired about this model and really wanted to bring it to Wisconsin is because, to me, it strikes a very elegant balance between ensuring that things that are addressed in citizen assemblies are set forth with a precise remit so that there is an opportunity for actual policy change. And it's not just like yet another thing where people sort of express themselves and we don't really know where it goes, right? And I recognize that the implementation is still a challenge, but it has the potential to be delivering a very specific policy recommendation. As a lawyer, I also think about the way that one of the more relevant existing models that I think works really successfully in the United States that many of us are very accustomed to is jury duty.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I also love about this model is that it is rigorous about sortition. In our community and civil society work, we see that so many entities, whether they be public or nonprofit, genuinely want community input, or at least genuinely attempt to create spaces where people can provide input. But we know that there are access barriers and that those can serve some people's voices really well and others not so much, or comfortable for some, others not so much. And I do think that there is a equitable element to doing true sortition, in many cases compensating, giving people the roadmap to how to get in the door and be selected. And I wonder if any municipalities in the US where they already have the muscle of a type of sortition and calling upon people with a different level of legal authority given, but still, if that's been raised anywhere as a way to sort of make an efficiency around sortition. Because I think sortition, while I think it's exciting, I also recognize what an incredible effort, but what a burden that would be. So that's a very specific question. And then I have two more broad-based ones that I want to kind of leave you with. One is, yesterday someone spoke about, there was a presentation on the AI app that was meant to coach someone through like dialogue, constructive dialogue. And they were like, I recognize the irony of needing to create an app with the machine conversation to prepare you for dialogue. And I kind of like, we shouldn't even be in this position to begin with, kind of thing, right? And it was sort of like a chuckle in the room about the absurdity of where we are and the levels of lack of skill or mistrust or the difficulty that we're experiencing. And in some ways, I think there's going to be a perennial issue in. Turn it off. Oh, it's not working. Oh, hello.
Yeah,
Oh,
there
it is.
you
Okay.
go.
Well, I'll just say that I asked Marjan if jury duty or the mechanisms for calling jurors has been looked at in any municipality. That was one of the things that I mentioned. But then the next thing that I'm mentioning, and this forces me to get to the point a little better, is that I can imagine a world in which government is working beautifully and we're not in a sort of vulnerable civic health moment where we feel that government is not being accountable to us, where there will still be thorny questions that, would inspire a moment to say, let's tap a fund and do a citizens assembly to deal with this particularly thorny thing. But I'm also kind of inspired about the way that like infusing some municipalities and communities with this could just be a step towards some repair about like, well, right now it kind of feels like the people that are most willing to run, deal with a campaign and get in office may or may not be the most skilled, may or may not do the best job once they're in there, may or may not really listen to their constituents once they're in there, may be supported by different kinds of interests or money. I feel like this also has the potential of creating this transparency and accountability thing. Yet I think that just having it, and because of the barriers that you referred to for implementation, there probably should be a layer of like rallying awareness when an assembly is going on in the community so that can become like a rally cry for people that want to see the policy implemented later and really hold electeds accountable. And I've heard you speak before about the way that often there will be like a public airing of the assembly's recommendations so that at least is a potential additional protection. So I guess just that's not really a question as much as like I would love to continue to explore the way that we could scaffold other civil society muscles like the media, or, tools like the media,
Mhm.
and, building sort of even non-participant awareness and engagement
Yep.
with the process. And that was a grant. We actually wrote a grant proposal with those elements included that I'd like to revisit. And then finally, the question that I'd like to leave you with so that we can really make sure we're all thinking about this together is we appear to be showing up on your map now among like a handful of states that have now had a FIDE touch in the United States. With us and other states that you're touching down in for a few days, but you'd like to, allow FIDE's resources and expertise to have an impact in a positive way, like what would you like to see happen next for people that have been able to hear this message and understand a little bit about it, understanding that like in May, we might not have something, but in the next 2 years, like people are going to remember this talk, things are going to come up, like what's the best way to sort of make this as productive as possible for your dissemination of these good ideas?
Thank you. Well, thanks, Mary Beth, for all those questions. That's a lot. And I just want to make sure if anybody has to go, I can answer some of them, and then maybe we can talk about some others. I agree with you about the elegance from sort of a legal perspective as well, and the proposal writing. But I will say that that is actually one of the dangers that we do see, is that sometimes those final reports and the proposal writing isn't given enough time to have proposals that are really actionable, that are well justified. That's really important to us when we're working on an assembly, to make sure that those proposals are really well written and well thoughtful. You asked a great question. I don't think that we have had much discussions with cities about sort of the parallels between juries. I mean, there are many parallels between juries and assemblies, but in terms of the sortition, it's a little bit different. I've never looked at it, but my understanding is that juries, you send out a letter and people come, and then of course there's always a chance that you're not selected. With juries, it's a two-tiered system. So we actually go through, and sometimes we do use cities. If they have lists that we can use, we will use those. But the first letter that goes out is about 5, 10, sometimes 15,000 letters that go out to a population. And then people who volunteer, we use that pool of volunteers, and we use very, very distinct criteria to make sure that the pool that we then select is representative of that community based on the remit. So it's a different process of sort of bringing that body together. But it's interesting to think about, and I will definitely think a little bit more about that. And then, yes, you're absolutely right. So we are thinking through different measures that need to be in place at the end of an assembly. We're still sort of learning in the US what an assembly is, and we're very careful at FIDE not to distract from the actual assembly process, and to make sure that the budget goes in so that that works really well. But yes, those conversations about sort of what types of processes need to be in place to make sure that the proposals then become policy. We do, we have implementers who have budgets to be able to set up working groups to then continue with the policy impact work. We definitely are starting to do local journalism. So we will have, not because you have a pool of participants who volunteer, and then a small pool that get accepted to be part of the assembly. So we've always talked about how there's a pool of people who want to be a part of this process who are not selected. So how can we make sure that we use them in ways that makes them feel like they're part of this process? And, blogging about this, being photojournalists, all of those things are things that we're thinking about and trying to implement. And then finally, thank you for the question about what could be. I mean, really, we just want to be able to support the ecosystem here. I think there's so much energy, and it seems like there's a lot of people who are thinking about this in the right ways. And I've had several conversations here since I've come. I think it's really just know that we're out there. If we can help, what we typically do are full-on 2-day capacity building schools. And then we do, the technical guidance that we provide throughout the process. And then, of course, evaluations. But however we can be helpful, just know that we're out there and happy to help. Thank you very much.